Most defendants accept their fate and move on. But when Pam Bondi was suddenly fined, she refused to back down. Her sharp and precise defense was so compelling that even the judge began questioning his own ruling. Pam Bondi never expected the day to unfold like this. Courtroom 3B in a Tampa courthouse was supposed to be just another stop in her schedule, a routine hearing. Nothing more. She had been in this room dozens of times, facing judges of varying experience levels. But nothing suggested today would be different. Seated at the defendant's table, Pam maintained a neutral expression, scanning a few notes in front of her. Across from her, the city attorney adjusted his tie, shifting in his seat as he waited for the judge to enter. The case was minor, at least. That's what it was supposed to be. A procedural matter that should have taken no more than 10 minutes. But the moment Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, Pam knew something was off. Dalton was a man who commanded the room without saying much. Tall, with a graying beard and deep-set eyes. He carried an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Typically, judges would take a moment to review case files, acknowledge the attorneys, and settle in before making any remarks. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he said, his voice flat, his expression unreadable. Pam straightened slightly, sensing the shift in tone. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Dalton continued, "and after considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $10, payable immediately." Silence. Pam raised an eyebrow slightly. But inside, her mind was already working. She had expected a discussion, a debate, perhaps even a warning. But this? A summary judgment without a single word of argument. The city attorney glanced at her, almost apologetic. Even he hadn't anticipated the case moving this quickly. Pam calmly folded her hands, her voice even. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments." Dalton barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. The room was too still. She wasn't the kind of attorney to lose her composure. But something about this felt deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a statement. She studied Dalton. There was something in his eyes, confidence that went beyond simple judicial authority. He wasn't just ruling on a case, he was putting her in her place. Pam's voice remained measured but firm. "If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here. Your Honor, I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had expected her to push back. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi. But I assure you, the outcome will be the same." That was when she knew. This wasn't just about the case, it was about her. Pam adjusted the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity. The fine itself wasn't the issue, she had fought bigger battles before. But principle? That was something she couldn't ignore. She met Dalton's gaze directly. "Then I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted again. Uncomfortable. The court stenographer, silent until now, repositioned in her chair. Even a few spectators in the back leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Pam let the silence linger just long enough to make an impact. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. She simply turned a page in her folder, more for effect than necessity, before finally looking up at Judge Dalton. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Are you saying that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" Dalton's expression didn't change. "I'm saying the violation is clear. And the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then she nodded. "Interesting." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Pam leaned back just a little, keeping her tone casual. "It's just, I've been practicing law for quite some time. And in all those years, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it. It's, what's the phrase, unprecedented." Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him, yet. But she was setting the stage, forcing him to respond. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and clerks waiting for their cases, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had likely witnessed thousands of hearings, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton let out a slow breath. Ms. Bondi, this court does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands, and we move on. Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He had opened the door. She adjusted her papers again. But this time, she didn't look down at them. She looked directly at the judge. Very well. Let's talk about Local Statute 14b, the one you claim I violated. She tapped a finger on the printed document in front of her. You say the law is clear. But that's interesting, because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years. With varying interpretations. Dalton's eyes narrowed. The language in subsection C, for example. Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year, a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under this statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom was completely silent. Pam could feel the shift happening. The judge knew it, too. Dalton straightened, his tone sharpening. Those cases do not apply here. Pam didn't miss a beat. Don't they? She turned another page. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language of the ruling in Reynolds v. Clearwater was pretty clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words sink in before adding, and I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore precedent. Dalton clenched his jaw. Pam let that hang in the air for just a second before delivering the next blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law. In which case, I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Ms. Bondi? Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh. Devoid of amusement. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but significant. She had shifted the power dynamic. She had forced the judge to defend his position rather than simply issuing rulings without question. Dalton knew it, too. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off. His eyes stayed locked on Pam's. There was a long pause. Then, finally, the judge spoke. Very well. You may present your defense. Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. Most defendants, when faced with a ruling, accept their fate and move on. But when Pam Bondi was unexpectedly fined, she refused to yield. Her resistance was so sharp that even the judge began questioning his own verdict. Pam hadn't anticipated the day unfolding like this. Courtroom 3B in a Tampa courthouse was supposed to be just another stop in her schedule, a routine hearing. Nothing more. She had been here dozens of times, facing various judges, and nothing suggested that today would be any different. Seated at the defendant's table, she remained composed, skimming her notes. Across from her, the city attorney adjusted his tie, shifting slightly as they waited for the judge to arrive. This case was a minor dispute, a simple procedural matter that should have taken no more than 10 minutes. But the moment Judge Raymond Dalton entered the room, Pam knew something was off. Dalton carried an air of authority that filled the space effortlessly. Tall, with salt and pepper stubble and piercing eyes, he exuded an intimidating presence. Most judges would review the case files, acknowledge the attorneys, and settle in before speaking. Not Dalton. We begin immediately, he announced, his voice devoid of warmth. Pam straightened in her seat, sensing the shift in the air. The court has reviewed the case. Dalton continued. After careful consideration, I rule that the defendant has violated Local Statute 14b and must pay a $10 fine, effective immediately. Silence fell over the room. Pam raised an eyebrow, but her mind was already racing. She had expected arguments, discussions, perhaps even a warning. But this? A ruling without a single word of defense. The city attorney cast her an almost apologetic glance. Even he hadn't expected things to move this fast. Pam laced her fingers together, her voice steady. With all due respect, Your Honor, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my defense. Dalton didn't blink. A defense is unnecessary. The violation is clear. The law is clear. Pam took a slow breath, keeping her face unreadable. The room was too quiet. She wasn't the type to lose her composure. But something about this didn't sit right. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a statement. She studied Dalton closely. There was something in his gaze. A certainty that went beyond the usual authority of a judge. This wasn't about the law. This was about her. Her voice remained calm, but firm. If the law were truly that clear, we wouldn't be here right now. I request the right to present my case. Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had anticipated her defiance. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Go ahead, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you, the outcome won't change. In that moment, Pam knew this wasn't just about the fine, it was about principle. She adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, not out of necessity, but with intent. The money wasn't the issue. She had fought much larger battles before. But what she couldn't overlook was the precedent. She locked eyes with Dalton. Then let's begin. The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted in his chair. Uneasy. The court reporter, silent until now, adjusted her position. Even a few spectators in the back leaned forward, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Pam turned a page deliberately, then looked up at Dalton. Before I proceed, I need clarification on one point. Her voice was even, measured. Are you saying that the defendant has no right to present a defense in a legal proceeding? Dalton's expression remained unchanged. I'm saying the violation is clear. And the fine stands. Pam tilted her head, observing him. Then she nodded. Interesting. Dalton's brow furrowed. Excuse me? Pam leaned back slightly, her voice thoughtful. It's just that, in all my years practicing law, I have never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single argument. If I'm not mistaken, that is unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him, at least. Not yet. She was maneuvering him into a position where he had to respond. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even the officer standing in the corner shifted slightly. Dalton exhaled sharply. Ms. Bondi, this court is not a stage for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, present it. If not, we are done here. Pam allowed herself the faintest of smiles. He had just given her the opening she needed. She adjusted her documents, but this time, her eyes never left his. Let's talk about Statute 14b. The law you claim is so clear. She tapped her papers. It states that any entity failing to comply with a municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough. But the issue lies in how compliance is defined. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, unimpressed. And yet, Ms. Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly without issue. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting, because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She glanced at the city attorney, then back at Dalton. Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Ms. Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections. Pam didn't let him finish. Except when it doesn't. A murmur from the back of the room. Pam lifted another document and held it up. Let's talk about Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. The defendant in that case was fined under this very statute, same wording, same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused for emphasis. Do you know what the judge said in that ruling? That the law, as applied, fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unenforceable under scrutiny. Dalton's expression remained neutral, but the tension in his jaw said enough. The city attorney leaned forward. Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked. Pam cut him off before he could continue. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please enlighten us. The attorney hesitated. His silence spoke volumes. Pam turned back to Dalton. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton sat back, eyes scanning her, calculating. Pam knew exactly what he was doing, stalling. trying to find an angle to regain control. Finally, he spoke. The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours. Pam didn't blink. True, but the precedent applies all the same. The law is either clear, or it isn't. Silence. The weight in the room had shifted. Pam knew she had him cornered, not just because he was legally wrong, but because she had forced him into a position where any ruling he made now would be under scrutiny. Either he ignored precedent and risked his ruling being overturned, or he conceded. Dalton let out a slow breath. Ms. Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable. Pam smiled slightly. Then let's debate it. Pam let the silence settle. It stretched, thick and heavy, pressing down on the courtroom like a held breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, but it cut through the air like a blade. Without written witness statements, photographic evidence, or any tangible proof, this case relies solely on the subjective assessment of one individual. That directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the very appellate clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier. Whitaker didn't flinch, but he leaned back slightly in his chair. He knew she was right. She could see it in the way his fingers pressed together just a little tighter. Pam stepped forward. So I'll ask again. How does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the necessary legal foundation for enforcement? The silence that followed was absolute. Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench. His gaze locked on some invisible point in the distance. He wasn't looking at Whitaker. That told Pam everything she needed to know. He had expected to win. He had expected Whitaker to shut her down, to back her into a corner. Instead, she had flipped his own counter-argument against him, unraveling the case thread by thread. Dalton exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back. But when the court reconvened, Dalton did something no one expected. She stayed seated as the murmurs rippled through the room. Another recess wasn't a sign of strength, it was a stall. A sign that the judge was scrambling. And if there was one thing men like Dalton hated, it was losing control. When he returned, his entire demeanor had shifted. The passive confidence was gone. His jaw was locked. His expression unreadable. Whitaker still sat beside him, but his posture had changed, more reserved now, more distanced. Whatever came next, it was clear Whitaker had no intention of intervening. Not yet. Dalton cleared his throat. Ms. Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments. Pam heard the tightness in his voice. This was not a man used to conceding anything, not even the smallest point. However, he continued, this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands. Pam blinked. Interesting. So he was doubling down. She inhaled slowly, as if considering his words, then turned to the court stenographer. Can you read back the last statement, please? The stenographer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, barely hesitated before repeating, the fine stands. Pam turned back to Dalton. Just so I understand correctly, Your Honor, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof? In direct contradiction to established appellate precedent? Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. Ms. Bondi, he said slowly, this court has discretion. Pam allowed herself the smallest smile. It does, but discretion is not immunity from legal standards. The city attorney shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He could see where this was going. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the bench. Let's put this in plain terms. If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word, no evidence, no documentation, just an assertion. Dalton's silence was deafening. Pam turned, sweeping her gaze across the courtroom, the attorneys, the clerks, the bystanders. Imagine the implications of that. A business owner gets fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner is penalized for something they can't even verify. And if they challenge it? Too bad. The court has discretion. A few heads nodded, subtle but unmistakable. Pam turned back to Dalton. That's not discretion, Your Honor. That's unchecked authority. The weight of her words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Finally, Whitaker spoke. You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process. Pam nodded. Not just due process, judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, The entire legal system starts to erode. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. He knew it, she knew it, and now, everyone else in the room knew it, too. The city attorney finally spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton held up a hand. His face was unreadable, but Pam could see the frustration in his eyes. There was no winning this. Not for him. After what felt like an eternity, Dalton exhaled. "This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement." His voice was stiff, reluctant. "The fine is overturned." A murmur rippled through the room. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. And just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she stepped toward the exit, Dalton's voice rang out one last time. "Ms. Bondi." She turned. Dalton's eyes met hers. "I underestimated you." Pam gave him a small smile. "You wouldn't be the first." Then she walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor. But she knew one thing for certain: this case wouldn't be forgotten. It had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. And somewhere, in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. She stepped into the marble hallway, her pace steady, her mind sharp. This had started as a routine hearing. It had become a battle over power, law, and ego. And she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget moments like these. They didn't like losing, especially not in public. As she neared the courthouse exit, a voice called from behind. "Ms. Bondi." A moment. She turned to find Judge Whitaker approaching, his expression unreadable. "Something on your mind, Judge?" she asked, arms loosely crossed. Whitaker studied her for a moment. "You're good." Pam smiled slightly. "I try." He nodded, then glanced toward the courtroom doors before lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "I wasn't brought in to observe, Ms. Bondi. I was brought in to contain." Pam raised an eyebrow. "To contain what, exactly?" Whitaker exhaled. "Judge Dalton doesn't like losing. In this case, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example." She already knew that, but hearing it confirmed made the victory all the more significant. "So what happens now?" she asked. Whitaker hesitated. Then, with a look that was equal parts respect and warning, he said, "You'll have people watching you. And not just here." Pam understood exactly what he meant. Today, she had done more than win a case. She had challenged a system that thrived on compliance. And that had not gone unnoticed. She nodded. "I appreciate the heads up." Whitaker gave her one last look before turning back toward the courtroom. Pam pushed open the courthouse doors, stepping into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, sharper, clearer. Power wasn't about who sat behind the bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. Power was knowing the rules well enough to challenge them. And today, she had done just that.